Hello, hello, hello. Okay, so today on this video we're going to look at guilt in heroes. Um, Again, look at the other videos. There are other themes out for heroes. There's also some Inspector Cars and Mice and Men. Get yourself on these videos. Get yourself taking some notes, please. So let's look at guilt. And Francis. He is consumed with guilt throughout the novel. This is something that just constantly comes to the forefront and constantly is something that he reminds us as the reader. I am guilty. I'm not a hero. What I did was terrible. And yet it's right until the end. Right, not until the end, sorry, that we actually find out what that was. So let's look at that in more detail then. So he feels guilty because of his intention to commit murder with Larry. I think he also feels guilty with his intention when he went to war to commit suicide as well. But the main source of his guilt comes from that interaction with Nicole and Larry. The fact that he failed, the fact that he didn't stop Larry from attacking Nicole in that way. But that's compounded, that's made bigger, that's made more severe by the guilt he feels when anyone ever calls him a hero, because he knows, and we at a certain point know, that he didn't go to be a hero. He went to take his own life. So this facade of bravery, this facade of being a hero, being brave enough to go, is something that really plays on his mind, makes him feel guilty. And I think that's one of the things that keeps driving him to that interaction with Larry at the end there. And I think he struggles with it so much, because there was that lack of bravery there. So unlike Francis, Larry doesn't really seem to be troubled by guilt. Regret, yes, we can argue that. When we see him in chapter 14 with that final interaction, he regrets that he can't, there's no more dancing, no more sweet young things for me, Francis. But there doesn't appear to be any guilt. I think the only shred of guilt that we see is perhaps when Francis confronts him. I think it does affect him to see that he affected Francis. So I think there was this special relationship between Larry and Francis, a relationship that perhaps shouldn't have been there, that shouldn't have developed. But I do think when you really read it and you analyse their interactions, I think it was special. I think it was something that stood out for them. This sort of father-son like relationship. But apart from that, I think there never really is any guilt displayed by Larry for what he's done. And in chapter 14, it explains this view of, everyone sins. We should have, one sin doesn't get rid of all the good things. Does that one sin of mine wipe away all the good? Remember, dropping in those quotes where you can when you're writing in your exam. Learn to say it that way. I can say here, I'm one sin should not be allowed to wipe away all the good. But if I remember that wording of that quote, use that in my revision. Make that the way you say it. Being able to drop those little quotes in will be really helpful. So what's interesting is that this desire for sweet young things, that's just a flaw in his nature to him. His only regret, as I said, is that idea that Francis, and Nicole as well, but Francis no longer sees him as the hero of their childhood. Larry is very complex. He's somebody that, as a reader, as somebody trying to analyze him, he's quite difficult because he sits on both sides of the fence. He feels guilt, but he also doesn't. He feels regret, but he also doesn't. He's a hero, but he isn't. It's quite difficult. Excuse me. So we can argue that this becomes more and more difficult. To decipher what is guilt and what is regret, and I think most teachers would agree that it is regret for what he can't do anymore rather than that guilt. And there's a poignant image here, that moment where Larry has the gun across his lap and reminds Francis, I'd been thinking about this myself. This is something that plays on my mind. That's just an image to keep in your head and remember. We'll also go straight on to forgiveness here because it does tie in quite closely with guilt. So this is introduced in chapter 1 when we see Francis praying for a man who has done him harm. He says, I pray for the man I am going to kill. And that element of religious forgiveness is emphasized again in chapter 12 when he hides in the confessional at St. Jude's. And he wants that immediate forgiveness for his sin of abandoning Nicole. But again, throughout, we often get told, he can see the steeple of St. Jude's. He talks about his time in school. Sister Mathilde comes out. That religious forgiveness sort of just is sort of dropped in here and there, just to remind us that it's there. Larry, however, seems quite quick to forgive himself, as he doesn't experience that sense of guilt that Francis does. But Francis really struggles throughout the novel to find that forgiveness, and I think in his head that forgiveness will come from taking Larry's life and then his own, which we know is his original plan. Nicole is the character who personifies goodness. She is pure, she is sweet, she's kind. Her first words to Francis are forgiveness. She apologizes to him for the words she said to him after the attack. Remember, this is in the present. Although we see her in the past speaking to Francis, actually the first real words we hear to Francis and from her is right at the end of the novel, when we see her in the present. And she apologizes about what she said to him. Instantly, that element of forgiveness, even though that terrible thing that she went through, she forgives Francis. It's not clear whether that actually relieves Francis of his burden of guilt. We don't see Francis take his own life at the end, and Francis becomes very quiet and reflective in that conversation. So, it's difficult there to decide whether that's effective or not. And although she forgives him, Nicole doesn't forget, and the friendship can't be there. And I think that's a reminder there to the reader that forgiveness does not necessarily mean that everything is expunged, everything is removed from the situation. And it's interesting to know here, Robert Cormier, when he was asked about guilt in his novels, said, God is always there to forgive you, but it's harder forgiving yourself. And I think that really shows in this novel. If you think about Francis, if you think about what he went through, the forgiveness is there from Nicole. The forgiveness is there from us as the reader. You do feel like going, it's okay. What could you have done? You were a young boy. Larry was a soldier. He was knife-like, lethal, manipulative. The Pied Piper of the children of Frenchtown. What could you have done? You are forgiven. But he cannot forgive himself, and I think that's something to remember there. Okay, so as I say in all my videos, make sure you send me questions, send me examples of answers, let me know. You can put them in the Google Classroom and I will pick them up. Or if you go to the school email, start typing in Harrison, I will probably pop up, but I know most of you have my private email anyway. So go look at the other videos, go do some revision, make sure you're revising, and I'll see you very soon. Bye!